Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing somewhat of a collection of things. In part, this is going to be a discussion specifically surrounding the topics of trope marketing, practices within publishing that maybe we have inadvertently played a role in and that we haven't necessarily wanted to perpetuate, but we have based off of some of our practices here online when talking about books. I also want to talk about some books and highlight an author whose works I feel are, while not necessarily underhyped or underrated, I do think that they're not discussed all that often on BookTube. Potentially it's just that I'm not seeing it in the circles I'm a part of, but that's going to tie into the conversation about trope marketing and trends in general. And then in some ways is going to be a little bit like a mini review. I do want to note in the past when I have made videos about books that I think deserve more love here on BookTube, I'm going through a number of different authors' works and highlighting a lot of different things. Here I am sticking specifically to the author Erin A. I have read 4 books by this author at this point, 2 of which are essentially within the same series, although I'll touch on that because I do want to give you an overview of this author's works, and then 2 of which are standalones that are separate and removed from those others. Now, I do want to kind of give an indication of what we're talking about here when I say that this author, clearly these books are not necessarily the ones that are hidden gems that nobody has heard about, and this is based off of if you just look on paper and at some pretty clear signs. So for example, the first book that a lot of people came to know this author through came out about 6 or 7 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, called House of Salt and Sorrows. This is a fairy tale retelling, specifically a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling, but it was made into something much more dark and much more grim, and so it was kind of a unique take on that retelling. And within that, you'll see on Goodreads, it has, I believe, over 100,000 ratings. So certainly not, once again, reiterating, a hidden gem. This isn't an author who nobody's ever heard of or anything like that. And then another thing is, beyond just how many ratings it has on Goodreads and how high the ratings are, that sort of thing, you oftentimes, if you walk into a bookstore, you will find these works either stocked, which is a big thing. If a work is never stocked, that usually means that it's not quite as successful. So for example, I'm not kidding when I tell you I was in a TJ Maxx. It was a TJ Maxx or a Marshalls, whatever, one of those home goods stores, and they had Rebecca Yaros's works. They had Iron Flame. Iron Gold is Pierce Brown. They had Iron Flame and Fourth Wing, and I was like, what? By the mugs. And I was like, what's going on? Anyway, so back to the point though. Sorry, a little side tangent there. So you'll have this author's works are typically stocked when you go into a bookstore. And beyond that, I remember the one that is somewhat of a sequel to House of Salt and Sorrows, House of Roots and Ruin. I remember that being in the front on tables, and it even got the sprayed edges treatment, and it had exclusive editions, maybe not necessarily the kinds of amazing book box editions that have all the bells and whistles, but it certainly got a little bit more attention, and it had some attention to detail put into the presentation of the book, as well as how much your eye is likely going to take note of it when you're in a physical brick and mortar store. Besides just those 2 books, there's also the book Small Favors by this author and The 13th Child. The 13th Child is one of the newer releases from this author, and I read The 13th Child recently and really, really liked it, and I thought about making a review for it, which this is going to be somewhat of a review in a sense within the course of this discussion today. But I thought about making a review for it, and then I thought, well, even though I like this author's work, Small Favors is one of my favorite standalones. Not all-time favorite standalones, just to be clear, but I do quite like that standalone, and I was thinking, well, I like this author's works, and when The 13th Child came out, even though I stay pretty up to date when it comes to fantasy releases, and I like this author's works, this completely flew under the radar for me. I didn't even know that it was being released when it came out. And then when I saw it was being released, which I think I only knew because I think it was a Book of the Month pick, and then I was really bummed out. Not that it was a Book of the Month pick, just to be clear. I was bummed out that I didn't know it existed, and I thought, man, how did I let this one slip by? I liked Small Favors so much. So how did I miss this? I make anticipated releases every month for upcoming months, and it might have just been a hiccup on my part. Maybe I just goofed and didn't know, but I thought, okay, well, I missed the mark on that one. And then I thought, well, I don't remember seeing other people talk about this book coming out, and I follow a lot of other creators online who are obviously also fans of books, And I don't remember anybody really hyping this one up. So did we all kind of collectively forget this was coming out? Or even if it's not an author who you've checked out before, they're an established author at this point, so I feel like some of us should have talked about it. And I don't want to imply that nobody was talking about it, because of course somebody, I'm sure plenty of people were talking about it, but in the circles that I'm in, I wasn't really seeing it talked about. And then I decided, okay, well, I do want to read this book, certainly, so I'll try to request the audiobook from my library app, because I like immersion reading, I like having a mix of physical and audio. And then there was a huge wait line. And so I was like, okay, is this book, is it everybody knows it's coming out or nobody knows it's coming out? And I know that's a goofy, weird, dumb thing to get caught up in, but it got me thinking about how we do put ourselves in these sort of boxes, and we put ourselves in almost like cliques and groups. And I don't think we do it to be exclusive and to remove people, or I don't think we do it with the intention of ever gatekeeping, like, no, this is our area. We're the epic fantasy fans. You stick to your subgenre. I don't think any of us are trying to do that. But of course, we gravitate towards the things that we like. We gravitate toward people who often share some of our interests, and we get really sucked into it because we hype up the books that we love, and sometimes we make entire channels dedicated to a certain series, or we will sometimes have read-alongs for an author's collection, or we'll go through backlist works by an author, or whatever the case may be. Our view, even within whatever genre you like, let's not even talk about subgenres, but if we're just talking about genres, we have a certain genre that we really like. And the more we get into it, especially in online spaces, and the more we connect with other people, even though we love fantasy as a whole, just to use this as an example because that's what I read, or I read other things, but that's my main home base, I'll say. Even though, as the example, we like fantasy, and we like to not just have everything be super specific, and we only like one very narrow kind of fantasy, we do accidentally start narrowing our tastes when we start getting like, okay, I liked this book, what else can I read that's like this book? Wow, this person made a whole list of things, and I do this too. I make lists of, you like this, try that. So then we find that, and then it's like, well, what else is like this? I didn't like this one as much as the original thing. Is there something else that's as good as the original thing? And then you find something, you're like, I like this even more. What else can I get that's just like this? And we start to just end up falling into these, I do think, narrow views of what fantasy can be, or we start to read in one specific niche. And when I think about BOOKTUBE Darlings, and this is something I like to every now and then step back and assess, what are the books that feels like all of us are picking up? And how is this us finding something and wanting to hype it up, and how much of this is marketing has put it right in front of our faces, and so we end up picking it up, or it's popular because it's a popular author, so we end up picking it up, and then we're all talking about the same things, and we're never talking about these other things. So I was thinking about some BOOKTUBE darlings. As an example, Blood Over Brighthaven has definitely taken off. And The Will of the Many. So many people have picked up The Will of the Many and loved it. And you're even seeing this one get picked up on channels where maybe they read a lot of different genres, and then they pick up The Will of the Many, and they're like, this is amazing. Or people that hardly ever pick up fantasy pick this up, and they're like, this is amazing. People are loving The Will of the Many. The Tainted Cup is another one that's turned into a BOOKTUBE darling. Abercrombie's works, Sanderson's works. You'll see a lot of Stephen Erickson and Robin Hobb talked about. So we have newer fantasy and backlist fantasy, but we have certain ones that a lot of us end up really liking, or we check out, and we end up hearing about them over and over and over again. And then it just was so odd to me to have something that I'm like, I like Erin A. Craig's works, and I keep up with newer releases. I literally, for my job, talk about fantasy books, and this one slipped under my radar, but it's obviously popular somewhere, right? It's obviously doing well for itself. This author is doing well for themselves, so it just made me kind of think, like, how am I playing a part in this situation that we all, in some fashion, I think, are participating in on accident? But then what's that have to say about how we're being marketed to? And this leads now into the portion of this that's kind of tied to trope marketing and the practices within publishing that a lot of us complain about, but then accidentally are feeding right into. Something that I think is more overt, or at the very least, perhaps it's just the people in my circle think it's overt and it's happening to us too, and we just don't see it as much. But I do think that this conversation comes up more often in talking about fantasy romance. Part of why I think this is more present potentially in fantasy romance is because this is a more emerging genre that has kind of formed in its own way separate from fantasy. It used to be a subgenre. It's gotten so popular that it is now, I always call it like a sister genre, because I still think it falls under the umbrella of fantasy, but I also recognize it's so big and there's different expectations of it that it's kind of branched off into its own thing. But regardless, this comes up a lot because of the fact that it's newer, and so I do feel like the genre is forming around a certain set of expectations, and as a result, when something branches outside of that, there is the question of, is that fantasy romance, or is that romantasy, or is that just fantasy with a subplot that had a romance at the center, or what even is this? I don't know, and people kind of end up having these debates. And then there are things that are cozy fantasy that lean somewhat more almost like contemporary romance, but they have fantasy elements baked in, and then that gets sometimes under the fantasy umbrella, and then the Goodreads Choice Awards come around, and then it's seen as fantasy romance, and then people are like, that's not fantasy romance. The point is, I do think that fantasy romance has certain expectations and tropes that it's developed itself around, and it's going to take time before it goes into new areas and it does things that subvert expectations. I think a great example of how this starts to be is something like, I just mentioned how Abercrombie is sort of a BookTube darling author, and also I talk about Abercrombie a lot, but within the First Law trilogy, the First Law trilogy is one of those things where I do think it's great in general. However, I also think it's one of those stories that it's almost, you could argue, better if you're a fantasy fan who sees the way that he is essentially taking the blueprint we've seen so often and then playing around with it, borderline satire of it, where it's like this quest story and there's this purpose, and he's like, what if none of it meant anything? And if you read it and you're not familiar with fantasy, it is so exceptionally underwhelming. I do think it's kind of underwhelming in general. I still stand by the idea that by the end you're kind of like, oh, I mean, that wasn't the most satisfying conclusion, but that's kind of the point. And I feel like it's making for interesting conversations. But regardless, you kind of can't really have that until something has solidified itself as a common thing within the genre. And within fantasy, we've had so often the Tolkien-esque type of fantasy, and it took a long time for it to come out of that. Returning, though, to the way that this is more overt and obvious within fantasy romance, I do think that fantasy romance readers are often like, this is what I like in fantasy romance. I like these tropes, and then you'll see stories marketed. We've seen this all before. I've talked about it. Other people have talked about it. Other people have made entire videos dedicated to it. The idea of you'll have a picture of a book and whatever tropes are present in that book, within that book. And then that's it. You don't need to know the synopsis. Sometimes it feels like you don't even really need to have a plot. You just need to have from point A to point B, like the navigating of these tropes until you check them all off, and then the characters hook up, and then that's the story, and then it's like, oh my gosh, can't wait for the sequel. You're like, but what happened, though? What was the book about? What was the character development? I want a little bit more. And I think that can happen in any genre. As stated, it's just more obvious right now within this newer work, but I do think that this happens within fantasy circles as well. We start getting kind of into our, well, I want to return to epic fantasy. I want to return to sword and sorcery kinds of fantasy. And we start craving a certain kind of thing, or I want genre bender fantasy. All these things that we want. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting those things, to discuss lists that have those things. But then we start getting in these little groups and these hyper-specific niches. And though it's just kind of a constant back and forth echo chamber of like, oh my gosh, I love this. Yeah, I love that too. I want more like this. And then publishing's like, oh, they want more of that. Let's give them more of that. And then we keep getting things that feel kind of similar. And then we end up completely missing that there's all sorts of other fantasy books that exist out there that might kind of open our eyes a little bit to other things that exist. And this goes in two different areas. I think that this plays into us collectively thinking that everything is the same when maybe everything's not the same. I mean, and maybe a lot of things are too similar. I certainly think there are a lot of things that come out that I'm like, this was basically a carbon copy of this other thing over here. I'm not trying to imply that publishing's perfect and we're all just in our own circles and we're oblivious or anything like that, because there's criticisms all around that we want things to get better and we want to ensure that authors have freedom to make creative choices and that they are actually being supported by their publisher. And if they're self-pub, that we are branching out and we're checking out self-pub. All these things, I think criticisms go all around, and that we want things to improve. That's why the criticisms exist. That said, I do think we will hear sometimes they're like, what's happened? Where'd all the fantasy go? That's something I see sometimes. And to be snarky, I kind of one time wanted to walk into a bookstore with that, like, where's all the fantasy? And just walk into a bookstore and go to the fantasy section and just get footage of all that and go to so many different bookstores and do the same thing and be like, oh, I found it. Because, like, it still exists. It's still there. It's just not the thing that's maybe the most popular, the most in your face. But sometimes stuff is in our face. That's the part that's so strange to me, is sometimes, like in the case of Erin A. Craig's books, I remember seeing House of Roots and Ruins in the front of the store. I know this author's works are relatively popular, but in my head I'm like, but where? And it's my own fault. I guess that's what I'm saying, is I feel like I'm using myself as an example of somebody who, while I also agree with a lot of the criticisms that are made toward publishing and trope marketing and all those sorts of things. And while I like having conversations where I include your feedback, and while I like to assess trends and try to not necessarily fit into them too much when I don't like what's happening, or when I do like what's happening, I try to highlight and support the things that I think are great. I myself have fallen into the trap of only seeing sometimes the things that are being released by Orbit and Tor, or that I see discussed here on BookTube in the circles that I'm a part of, and I feel like sometimes I'm not branching out as much as I could. I do on occasion. I think I actively make an effort, is what I should say. I do actively make an effort to not only read the popular stuff. I try to have a balance of popular and lesser known. I try to have a balance of newer and backlist. I try to ensure that I am not allowing everybody else's thoughts and feelings about things to impact my reviews. In fact, I actively avoid seeing other people's, because, and this is a whole other conversation, I do think there's a level of integrity involved when you're constantly seeing, what do my patrons think of this? What do other reviewers think of this? What do people on Goodreads think of this? What do people on Book Talk think of this? Okay, now I'll do a review. And you're like, those aren't your thoughts anymore, though. A little bit. You've heard so many other people's thoughts. You know what the general opinion is. And maybe even if you don't mean to, you're just going to kind of tell people what they think because you want them to agree with you. And you might not do it on purpose, but a lot of us, that's just human nature, and we get insecure and we want people to like us. And then, so I try to resist all of that, because I'm like, if I put my opinion out there and nobody agrees and everybody thinks I'm dumb, oh well, that was my opinion of whatever said thing. I remember really vividly with the Wheel of Time show, the cold open of one of the episodes where there's a fight scene. I thought it looked bad. I thought the choreography was bad. And I said that, and everybody got mad at me. And they're like, no, it's great. And not everybody, that's a huge exaggeration. But I remember one person being like, you're just trying to purposefully be antagonistic in a sense. Like, you're trying to be controversial. I'm like, I thought everybody also would think that this sucked. I thought it was bad. I didn't know that people wouldn't. I'm not trying to be anything. This is just what I thought. So even though I make an effort, this is returning to the point, even though I make an effort to ensure that I'm relaying my thoughts on things, regardless of whether other people are going to agree with me or not, I do still think that we all likely, and I'm trying to use myself as an example, find there are times where we inadvertently perpetuate the very things that we are actively trying to push up against. And I think that this whole thing with the 13th Child, that book, and me wanting, I liked it a lot, and I like this author's works in general. Even though all of that is true, I still completely missed that because I'm over in my fantasy circle and a certain group of, I think, a certain kind of fantasy here on BookTube. And I really liked this work, and I wanted to talk about it, and I wanted to let all of you know about it, because maybe you're like me, and maybe you didn't also know that this book came out, and I thought it was fantastic. So I'm not just gonna mention this book, I want to kind of hype up Erin A. Craig in general. House of Salt and Sorrow and House of Roots and Ruin are the ones that a lot of people, I think, know this author from. House of Salt and Sorrows, as stated before, was a 12 Dancing Princesses retelling, but with sort of a grim fairy tale twist to it, and I think it really well combined fantasy and horror. I think this one, however, is the one that, not that this is a bad thing, it's just my assessment of it, I think it's the one that feels the most young adult. Also, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was the author's debut. So there's a few things here and there that feel maybe a little less than original, even though there are aspects of it that I think felt really unique and like the author was coming into their own and doing something really cool. Then House of Roots and Ruins came out years later. Technically, while it does have a character who was in House of Salt and Sorrows and it does reference events from that book, I do feel like it was written in a way where you could read that one first if you wanted, and it feels like there's going to be a sequel to that. And I think that if there is, because based off the ending, it definitely feels like there's going to be another one, I almost feel like House of Roots and Ruin and whatever comes out after is going to almost feel like a duology, and then House of Salt and Sorrows kind of feels like a prequel standalone in a sense, because of the fact that they have this feeling of disconnect. I also think House of Salt and Sorrows felt more overtly horror inspired, because there are some really disturbing scenes. I think the descriptions are really great in that one, and the sense of reality being warped is really well done. So I think it's a little bit more scary in the sense that if you're up late at night, that one would be like kind of spooky to read at night. House of Roots and Ruins is less scary in that sense. It's more sinister when you discover what some of the antagonists have been up to, I'll say. And so it's disturbing, but not in the I can't stay up late at night and read this kind of way. It's just more, as I noted already, it's a little bit more sinister in how it's baked into the story. I enjoyed both of these. I am somebody who, while I more often than not read adult fantasy, I do like dipping my toes in young adult fantasy here and there, and I do think that these ones feel a little bit more on the young adult side. So if you are somebody who likes adult fantasy, but you are kind of scared easily, then if you want to branch out and read a little bit more fantasy horror, then maybe these would be good ones if you find that you tend to get kind of scared easily. If you're somebody who really is not somebody who typically likes reading young adult, and if you're going to read horror, you want all the most disturbing of things, maybe these aren't the ones for you. But if you're somebody who likes young adult and adult, or you primarily like young adult fantasy, I'd say give these ones a go. I quite enjoyed them. That said, small favors for me, while perhaps feeling a little less fantasy, this one had such a great buildup of tension. And it felt very cinematic. Like when you watch a movie or a mini series where something creepy is happening and little things, somebody will say they saw something and you're like, whatever, that's small town gossip. And then somebody else says something, you're like, wait, no, now this is getting weird. And then, oh, wait a second, that person seems suspicious, but they seem like overly suspicious. So is it actually this person that, and you just kind of start to second guess everything, and little things start to build and build and build. Small Favors does that so well. And I can't even tell you that much about the main character, because my hatred for their brother was so intense. If you love to hate a character, and I mean hate in a good way, like they're so well written to be hated. If you love hating a character, I don't know too many other characters I hated more. And I can't say why. I mean, I should clarify. I can tell you why, but it would be kind of spoilery, so I'm not going to tell you why. But if you pick it up, I hate him so much. And you start to be like, okay, well, maybe he's not as bad as I thought. And then he does something, you're like, never mind, he's even worse than I thought. I hate this guy. And there's all sorts of scary things happening. And when you're like, okay, whoever's committing these atrocities, these creepy, horrifying things, I'm sure they're bad, but your brother, though, you know, whenever you have that feeling when you're reading a work of fiction where the borderline, like, bad guy you don't even hate as much as just this one character over here, I kind of really love that, and I feel like Small Favors did that so exceptionally. And while it is categorized as young adult, this is one where I don't know if it matters really if you typically read young adult or adult. I just feel like this is one that there's a decent chance you'll enjoy. I do think that the ending was not the strongest. Of course, as you read a story, you want the ending, you want the author to stick the landing, for it to be one of those things where you look back on the rest of it and, oh my gosh, everything feels different now. But I kind of think it was all about the build-up, similar to something like, for me, A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. I really enjoyed that one. It's quirky and it's fun and it's not really that scary, but I just enjoyed T. Kingfisher a lot. Anyway, but I do find that that's another one where it kind of got a certain way. I don't want to say too much. Something about aspects of the ending. I was like, well, the ending's not my favorite. It was the entire build-up there, and I feel like Small Favors, that description fits it very well. The 13th Child, a story where you have a character who their godfather is death itself. Death is, as you might imagine, sort of personified, and there are various different gods that are personifications of different things. And so our main character is somebody who has had Death personified, the dynamic between them was, I think, really done from a fantasy standpoint and a fairy tale standpoint, where this is a being that is not necessarily human. They don't quite understand how humans behave and think and act, but they are close to understanding those things, and they themselves experience a lot of similar experience a lot of similar emotions. However, they're not the same because they can live for forever. Time doesn't mean the same thing to them, and so you sort of explore that. You also see that this being has sometimes very explosive anger. You see the way that the character tries to manage that. They care very much about this godfather of theirs, but I do feel like the interpersonal relationship was exceptionally well explored, and I think that it is going to be very meaningful to a lot of people, because you see the way that the character tries to at times calm them down, or they try to navigate the conversations in a way where they can try to prevent their anger and their wrath, because most of the time they're lovely and they're pleasant, but anything to avoid when they have those explosive moments of anger. And that's something that I think a lot of people are going to really connect to. And that's not the focus of the story, that's not necessarily the point, but it was one of those things where that's part of what I think often makes a great story, is when you have those aspects tied into character dynamics and relationships in a way that feels really realistic and meaningful. But that's not even the whole point of the book. That's just one of the things that's done well. So I do think that the personal relationships in the story, perhaps of the ones I've read, I think that was probably the best in the ones I've picked up by this author. The plot is that Death is sort of treating this character to be a healer, and they have the ability to, the protagonist, she has the means of seeing what is ailing somebody, but she has to still educate herself on how to help them and ensure that she knows exactly what to treat them with, where to get those things. So she still has to put work in, but she's been given a little bit of an edge in knowing what is causing their ailments. The dark side of all of this, however, is that occasionally when she normally would see what is ailing them, occasionally there are moments where she sees that this person is not somebody who can be saved, and that death is awaiting them. And death cannot, meaning the personification of death, can't necessarily force somebody to die. They're just sort of there to help them pass on when they do. However, our main character has the ability to see when there isn't really a thing in place for them. If she tries to force them to live beyond their time, that is going to negatively affect other people. So the best thing to do is to try and ensure, or at least this is what she is taught, the best thing to do is to try and help them pass into death in a way where they're not going to be suffering for an extremely long time, but they're also not going to then live on and harm other people. And it's this horrible predicament that our main character has found herself in. And this especially becomes a problem when this is discovered about somebody of noble birth, because now she herself is in danger. If she doesn't save this person or help this person, then she likely herself is going to be harmed. However, she recognizes that if she helps this person and they go on to hurt other people, they're somebody of noble birth. They hold a lot of power and a lot of sway. So them going on to hurt other people could cause essentially catastrophes. So the moral conundrum in the story was exceptionally well explored. I thought the main character, I really liked her as a protagonist. I thought she was somebody who was inquisitive, hardworking. There were moments where she could be vulnerable. There were moments where she could be firm. And I just really enjoyed her as a character. I feel like her behavior was realistic. I liked the fantastical elements to it. I liked the way that this was somewhat of a grim fairy tale. I thought it was exceptional. I thought this was a really, really great book. And if you're a fan of fantasy standalones, I also thought it was great. Of all of the works, this is the one that felt the most like adult fantasy to me. I think that's another reason I was especially surprised that I was unaware of when it came out, because I'm usually so on top of knowing when adult fantasy works come out, but it might actually technically be categorized as young adult. This is one of those things where I can't help but wonder, is it categorized as young adult because the rest of the works are, so they thought that would be the best place for it, and that's where other people would see it, and maybe there's something to that, because obviously some people knew it was coming out and checked it out. Or is it that they really genuinely thought it felt more young adult? I thought it felt just as mature and written in a way that feels similar to a lot of the adult works that I pick up. And if you're a fan of adult fantasy and adult fantasy standalones, if you're a fan of morally gray stories, if you're a fan of fairy tale retellings, but in a way that feels original and fresh and unique and that are well written. I really think that this author did a great job with this story. I highly recommend it. I hope if people are like me and they're in the bubble that I'm in, that they're able to kind of get out of that bubble and know that this book is in existence and that they pick it up and hopefully really like it. If you've picked up The 13th Child, or any of Erin A. Craig's works, and you want to chime in with your thoughts, feel free to do so. If you have more to expand on within the first portion of this discussion, I know it was a little all over the place, but if you want to expand, of course, feel free to do so. And if you find that you yourself are sometimes in bubbles and it keeps you from picking up or knowing that things that you are positive that you're at the very least going to be interested in, if being within these bubbles sometimes causes you to even forget about the stuff that exists or not know it exists at all, feel free to mention that I'm not alone in that. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you're interested in any of these books, I'll have them linked in the description bar. Again, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.